So welcome to our panel discussion, Yashika and Christina. Thank you so much for joining us at such short notice at Third Eye. Really appreciate your presence here. Let's dive into the questions. Like, what did you think of the film? Like, we all just saw it virtually, all of us. Um, what are your thoughts that surfaced for you, both the plus and the delta? Maybe shall we start with Christina?
Sure. Well, as I just mentioned, I think the movie in general was very inspiring for me. And I think most often we have this very biased notion of who is the inspired and who is the one who's inspiring. And almost always the ones who are doing the inspiring tend to be the privileged ones, and the ones who are getting inspired tend to be the ones who are marginalized. But I think apart from the whole, the context in which the movie was being made and who made it and who sponsored it, just from the story alone, just from watching what was happening, I was so inspired. Um, I remember watching through the motions of how Sunita wants to stay with Khabar Lahariya, but then she's succumbing to the pressure of getting married. And then there's the line that says she comes back to Khabar Lahariya after her marriage. And I was like, that's probably the moment when I broke down quite intensely, to have her come back and to see that passion, that craving of wanting to tell her story and the stories of her people, and just about covering other stories too. That was very inspiring for me. And I was thinking, here I am sitting in an extremely privileged, extremely separated world of my own, and wondering if I should write that book at all, wondering if I should be telling these stories in the book at all. And then here are my women reminding me that yes, I should be doing that very thing. So that was incredibly inspiring. And the flip in, how we think that, inspiration can only come from so-called, successful people who are sitting at the top, because we've already decided what success looks like and what those parameters of that success is. I feel like these women are changing that very, very narrative. The second thing that struck me was the worlds that we all tend to inhabit versus the world that these women, these amazing women, are inhabiting and are working with and are challenging. And I feel like sometimes, thanks to social media, thanks to what Yashika went through on Twitter, and thanks to what we've all been going through for a while, we tend to think that this is the world that matters, and that this is the world that's going to define and mandate and command what we have to define of ourselves and what we need to produce. And then here are women who belong to a completely different world, where there is no fake wokeness, where there is no, conversations going around, ideology, and if you are this, then if you are that. They're just getting their work done. They are staying true to their craft. They are staying true to their journalism, their purpose in life, despite not being academically and professionally trained in the biggest of schools and stuff, and yet they are staying so true to their craft, regardless of what conversations are going around. I mean, and I think, like, if these women were to be active on social media like the way me and Yashika are, then they would probably be called out for, oh, you're covering a BJP rally, like, why are you doing that? I'm just thinking, like, these are the worlds that we inhabit. But I was really struck by their gumption and their complete dedication towards getting the work done. And I think that's what really matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear you completely. Some of the footage when they follow the BJP elections around stunning, but it also is very scary because they are like closest to the
Yeah.
to the frothing in the mouth Hindutva. Yashika, your thoughts?
I have to say completely 100% echo what Christina said. And, you know, I don't think it's just a movie that is inspiring for Dalit women as much as it directly speaks to us. It should be inspiring for every woman, every gender non-conforming person, every man who sees it, in terms of how do you literally squeeze water out of stone. That is that movie. And we know of Khabar Laharia. I'm sure I can speak for Christina as well. We have known of this newspaper run by these rural women going and conducting shul the reporting for a long time now. And sort of we've read stories about them. But to see them on screen, I think credit goes to the filmmakers in sort of bringing these people alive as beyond characters, but as real life women. And what I was, to echo what Christina said, in terms of their courage, I was blown away by how defiant these women are, because it's in an urban setting where, especially speaking for myself, growing up in small town India and then living in New Delhi, there are certain challenges that I simply don't face. And I, of course, have grown up with an immense amount of privilege compared to Mira, compared to Sangeeta, compared to Shamkali, in terms of that scene where they're talking about how it's difficult to read the mobile phone instructions because they're in English. That is something that I will never experience. But at the same time, their defiance in the face of addressing these men, and all you see, it's really striking, all you see around them is this mass of men, the sea of maleness, masculinity, and they're the lone feminine femme presence, and not scared of anybody or anything. I mean, one of the scenes where Sangeeta goes to confront the illegal mining mafia that's taking place in Bundelkhand, and they are clearly dismissive of her. They are asking her to stay in her lane. And and remember, she was one of those child miners who carried mica on her head. And despite that, look at the transformation this person has made from being a child miner to confronting those people who are responsible for her exploitation. That, I think, that thread has been captured really well by the filmmakers. And I do have to say that they did a good job of keeping upper caste narratives away from the screen, at least. Even if there are certain upper caste narratives involved with Khabar Laharia as an organization, what we see are the stories of, Sangeeta and Meera and Shamkali and so many other women. And I think I do have to say, being somebody who has worked in journalism for a considerable amount of time, this is a textbook case of shoe leather reporting. This is a movie that every journalism school across the world should be looking at and learning from. How to investigate, how to speak to your sources, how to get original documents from them. Those, as a journalist, when I was seeing those scenes where Shamkali is sitting with the father of a rape survivor, and he is showing her the original documents written in pen and ink as we see it by hand, and they're on the floor, and Shamkali is basically taking photos of them and the original documents, and the father breaks down because his daughter has just been raped. And the empathy with which she handles that moment, you cannot teach that. That is the hallmark of good journalism. I would say, if there is somebody from CUNY, Columbia, NYU, any of these journalism schools, show this movie to your students, because that is how journalism is done. And to speak about the conviction with which they do their work, it's so inspiring, because you can get caught up in the bureaucracy of the profession, like Christina was mentioning, in the what ifs. What if your ideology is right? What if you're saying the right things? Are you communicating it the right way? These women don't care about that. They have an unshakable belief in the fourth pillar of democracy, in journalism, in their word. They believe that their writing can bring a revolution, and it does. We see that they put out a story, somebody is arrested who was supposed to be arrested. They put out a story, a road is built. That is journalism in action. And going back to what Christina said about who is inspired versus who we think should be inspiring us, I think the story of these women shatters those barriers. It sort of completely takes us out of the mold of what barriers of class, caste, language, how to break them, and how it completely turns our perspective on who knows what, and how those people are able to exert themselves with the kind of power that they are able to do, whether it is in front of a BJP minister, whether it is in front of illegal mining mafia who can just take out an illegal revolver and kill her at that moment, or she's confronting a troll who's basically making a sleazy, vulgar sexual proposition to her because she's doing the reporting that she's doing. So I think this is a manual, a guide in journalism, which was extremely inspiring for me personally.
I think absolutely. Between the two of you, you've just given such a fantastic review of the film that I now want to go back and watch it all over again. And it's true, it's heartbreaking to see the sheer lack of resources. They don't even have consistent electricity, and they're lighting up the way in the darkness with their phones. It was very heartbreaking to watch that. And we often use the term Savarna fragility, which I think for me, like the first few minutes of watching the film was like, that's what I was tapping into as a Savarna, right? Like I couldn't watch the first few minutes. I had to stop and rewatch it. But look at the woman who was sitting and hearing those hard stories of brutal rape. And that's an everyday reality. Like, you were right. I think you were onto something, both of you, when you said that, that here were these stories straight from the horse's mouth, and they were representing their community. So they didn't need training for that, right? And they knew that nobody else is going to tell these stories. So if they didn't tell these stories, and that's something that they themselves acknowledge, right? So I was wondering if because we're all here in the diaspora, and this film is now making waves in the international film festival circuit to a lot of global audiences, how do you think this film works as a vehicle to make sense of the pervasive nature of caste, particularly in the diaspora? Because now that we've started having these conversations more actively around caste and entrenched casteism in the South Asian diaspora. Maybe if you can start with Yashika and then go to Christina.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, Preeti, because I was thinking about it earlier also when we discussed a little bit. I watched it with a friend who is American, and I've been trying to explain to him how caste works for a long time. But I think watching this movie gave him a sense of grounding. And this is just one person, of course, but I'm using, because we watched the movie together, I'm giving that example where, this gives a really good grounding in casteism to somebody who is completely unaware of how that system works. It tells you how caste is working on the ground, like scenes like Mira wants to enter a Dalit person's house. She says, let me remove my shoes. I don't want to dirty your house. And the Dalit man just melts into a puddle because he's never been shown that kind of respect before. He's the one who is standing outside upper caste people's houses, not daring to ever go in. And here is a woman, we don't know their caste relationship yet, but suffice to say that Mira is also Dalit herself. She gives him the kind of respect that nobody ever does to a Dalit person. And the kind of empathy that also all of these women, the kind of empathy that they have for their sources is something that goes beyond borders, that doesn't need that kind of, grounding in casteism for you to understand. But at the same time, what this movie doesn't do is talk about how that casteism translates into the context of being in the United States. But the question is, was that supposed to even happen? Is this the job of this movie, which is about these three women, which is about this newspaper, to talk about what's going on in the diaspora? It is our responsibility. It is the responsibility, you and me and all of us, to take this conversation and bring it here. I'm not sure if they would have tried to address what's happening in the US, what's happening in the UK, what's happening in Delhi, for example. That would have served this movie. This movie is, it's a lighthouse talking about Khabar Lahariya, and that's what it should be, in my opinion. However, conversations of caste are extremely important, and we have to use this as a vehicle to talk about how caste now is operating in the United States, within our networks, in our companies, in our colleges, in our living rooms. in this country, not back in India even. So that's our job to do. And definitely what it does is that when it is shown to an international audience, it becomes very hard to deny caste any longer, because the Savarna diaspora has very cleverly subverted that question and said, well, caste no longer exists. Like, we saw with the California textbook case, they wanted to remove the mention of the word caste because they said that this is a fake premise that is being used to bully their children. So that is going to get a lot harder. But I'm not sure if this was the responsibility of this one movie to do everything. It is on us, I feel.
Yeah, totally. Christina, what are your thoughts?
Well, I fully agree with what Yashika is saying, right? I mean, it's absolutely not the job of this movie to be having all kinds of conversations. Indeed, it's a call for all of us, both as people of the community, as well as allies, and as well as people in periphery, to be taking this movie and spreading the message across, raising awareness, whether it's in the diaspora or whether it's in the country. Having said that, I did feel that, given the examples of very similar movies that have come in the past, not necessarily about journalism in particular, but about caste in general, we've seen that these movies do exceedingly well in film festivals, winning awards, having conversations. For example, we did the Third Eye Film Festival conversation on Fundry itself, and this was like this was in 2014, right? This was so many years ago. And despite all of that, the conversation on caste remains to be a conversation, a subject of peripheral interest, even within the diaspora. And I see that often, like when we are submitting, whether it's book proposals or article pitches, and Yashika might know this much better than I do. Most often it gets to be treated as an academic conversation rather than a social current conversation that requires urgent and immediate attention. So my fear remains that this movie would be just treated as something that people watch out of interest or curiosity, and that's that. My work with the activists at Dalit Women Fight essentially had all of us having very similar sessions like the one that these women are involved in. For example, digital training, helping each other to operate a phone. What does it mean to going and shooting or getting your angle right? Of course, this is very journalism specific, but the kind of conversations are very similar. Getting people introduced into the tools and the tricks of what it means to be present digitally or visible digitally on social media even. And the struggle is very, very, very real, right? Like a struggle that probably we would not be able to fully relate because we grew up with technology. We know what a joy it was to get what it means to switch on and switch off. And we have a very vague window of what that digital illiteracy looks like through our parents and grandparents. But that is nothing compared to what women who are in these rural contexts particularly go through, particularly activists who are depending on these things to have some of their news and programs and campaigns covered. And when filmmakers such as these come into that context, make a movie out of it or make a film out of it, have some kind of coverage, not just filmmakers, activists, journalists from outside who come in and take these stories and show to the world. If I am right, the expectation from people who are working on the ground is that something really comes out of it, in terms of actual measurable impact for the women and the communities that they are working in. For example, in the case of Kabar Lahariya, what I would really wish for to happen in the diaspora or elsewhere or anywhere it matters is that the level of advocacy goes up several notches. Monetary support goes up. we have to, whether we like it or not, we have to accept the fact that friends in high places help, connections help. I mean, that's the state of the world that we are operating in now. So if these reporters and if these journalists were able to leverage some of that support through the channels and networks that we all have access to somehow, and we are not blocked by the state or by other entities and other characters, if in some way they are given that kind of power and support and, you know, scaffolding, that would be, to me, a success of this film.
Absolutely.
Not just, you know, conversations that you have, you know, in cafes and in film festivals and just about caste. I mean, these are conversations that we are having all the time, always. And, you know, my partner and I, we would just go to a friend's catch up, and they would be like, hey, what are you doing? Okay, I'm working on a book. Okay, tell us what the book is about. And then that just goes off into a long conversation about caste. So these are awareness raising conversations are always happening, but particularly with respect to this film, I would be very interested to see what kind of measurable impact these reporters and these journalists and the communities that they are operating in are being able to leverage through this film and through the visibility that this film is getting.
Yeah, I wanted to add, you know, exactly what Christina said. And to build on top of that, you know, this is something that we were talking about before we started recording. This movie is clearly well made. I think anybody who sees that would agree. And they've done a decent job of threading the different narratives through. But what remains to be seen, and now we come to the structural questions of who gets recognition. Ultimately, we do know that the two filmmakers, the filmmaker duo behind this movie, are upper caste Savarna people. They are clearly have, like Christina mentioned, the connections with Tribeca Film Festival, with Sundance, with like BBC. So these kind of connections are not easily accessible to somebody who is working in Khabar Lahariya, you know? So now, like exactly what Christina said, now what we need to see, what remains to be seen, is how is this platform broadening? When this movie makes it to the film festivals, when it is shown at Sundance, when who's getting the applause? I mean, of course, the story being told well is important and relevant, but the story already existed. It was just waiting for someone to tell it. And I think it is really important to see how they platform these three women, the entire team, and what physical, fiscal, monetary gain they are able to gain from the popularity of this movie. Because anybody who watches it knows that this is on an ascending trajectory. So it shouldn't just be one of those films that go and talk about the marginalized and shoot them well, and then they're nowhere to be seen and they're completely forgotten. Because, like, you know, little bit of what we were talking about earlier, the level of access that these women have given to the filmmakers in their deep, intimate lives, in their brains, in their hearts, in their souls, is staggering. And if they have opened themselves to so much that makes the storytelling that much richer, how does it get back, particularly to them, the larger community? And how does, you know, Christina made such an excellent point, how does the American community respond to that? I honestly don't have a lot of faith, and I'm sorry to say that, but I don't have a lot of faith in the Savarna community to highlight this conversation. Because, you know, one of the reasons Fandry happened, there has been a whole Dalit film festival that has taken place in the United States, but it hasn't gotten the same kind of impact, like, for example, a Bollywood film festival would. So I think the question now goes on to the progressives, the so-called American progressives, who shouldn't just treat it as a coffee table conversation, like Christina said, but really, you know, we can't be explaining what caste is over and over again. This has been happening. I've seen it in the 7 years that I've been here. I'm sure it's the sentiment that is shared by so many other Dalit people who are vocal in the diaspora, that, we're very tired of explaining to Americans what is caste. I think it's really time that they learn, and not caste from a race context, not caste the way Miss Wilkerson describes in her book, but caste as it exists in India. I think it's time that if this movie gets the platform that we all think it might, then that should sort of solidify a very real and organic and clear understanding of caste, because frankly, we are all tired of telling people over and over again what caste means.
Oh, this is all true. And I wish we could have had the filmmakers also listen to this, because it's important, right? You're talking about how it's important for them to reciprocate the level of trust that these women gave them. So what, and concrete material reality is that they are continuing to do this story in their stories in grave hardship, whereas they, the film, and, it's a very story well told, but the story that already existed is going on to getting more and more accolades, right? And in transparency, I wanted to tell you, I got to talk briefly to one of the filmmakers last week, Rintu Thomas, and she was. I did ask her, like, what do you think? What is your role as, like, your role is it to amplify, or is it to shine a light on these stories, or how can we enable the storytellers to tell their own stories, right? And I think that is what I was thinking, like, how can platforms like these, international film festivals, book festivals, and as somebody who's a former Savarna scholar, knows that academia has been historically very, very well kept, has kept out Dalit scholars, right? And has it changing slowly, do you think? And I think you kind of answered it, probably not, because it's resource wise, there's still a huge disparity of access to resources, networks, people that Savarnas have just generationally had access to, both in India and here in the diaspora, especially because who got to migrate first and build those networks, right? So it's a very clear, this film and the process of it showcases the material realities of the two Indias, so to speak. So, but do you think that it's changing slowly, both within India and here? And you can be as honest as you feel comfortable. You already have, both of you. Maybe we'll start with Christina. As somebody who, both of you have lived in India and are now here in the US. So how do you see that changing while you were living there, and now as you see India from a distance?
You mean in terms of breaking barriers into...
Breaking barriers, more democratic access to resources, networks, people. And I think the social media has enabled it a little bit, but also there's also lots more other noise and trolling that has also does not been of service. So I think it's both and, but I would like to know what it is for emerging scholars, Dalit scholars, filmmakers, storytellers, fiction writers, or who are trying to get access, but I'm sure it stops at some level. I'm sure there's still a lot of struggle to get beyond a certain point.
Sure. I think it's a great question. Although it's also a very complex question, right? That demands an answer. That probably, would not. The time wouldn't be enough to answer that to that complexity and depth. I think the model that we tend to have in our minds about some of these, some of these journeys is that it's a ceiling and that we are somehow breaking it, or it's a wall that we are somehow breaking it. And we tend to think of these obstacles and barriers as something that's very rigid and hard and brittle. But I would really invite us to visualize it as a mesh that's flexible, and that we are only trying to poke holes, and these holes get closed up if we are not vigilant enough. You know what I mean? And I feel like, people like Yashika, who has done what she had done what she has done and what she is going to do eventually, and people like me who's trying to do what we are doing, and a whole bunch of us as a community and as individuals, we are only trying to poke holes in this massive mesh that's just like really stopping us from making, entries into these places. And even if we do punch a hole, it gets closed up very soon in some way or the other. Because that's the thing about power, right? They will give you some amount of power, and then it gets taken back, or they will give you only a certain type of power, not all the kind of power. And if you were to look at it, and I keep talking about this, if you were to take a corporate space into as an example, you would only get to a point where you are in middle management. That's just that. Not that I buy into this capitalist hierarchy. I'm just giving an example of how Savarnas hold power and they keep to it. And it's very similar to how several of the other dominant majorities tend to hold power, or dominant minorities, as the case may be here, are holding on to power, for example, Brahmins within these corporate spaces. And I think that model kind of is very similar to what happens within academic spaces, within the arts, within social sciences, even within social media, for example. Everything has its own limits, its terms, its conditions to how much you can enter and when you would be taken out of it. And we are all very aware of it. I think a lot of us who are making these headways are very aware of it. And as you grow and as you gain more and more experience, you have to learn the ways to operate within this context. And that is why it's not as simple or as black and white as to, just following an ideology and just going through it. It takes a whole lot of strategy, a whole lot of tricks. It takes a whole lot of speaking a certain type of language, depending upon where you are in and who you're speaking to, in order to make these entries. So much so that at one point, you don't have to be vigilant. You don't have to be on guard all the time, because right now, we are all on guard. We are always vigilant, right? You can't be having a very regular conversation with a Savarna platform or a Savarna person who's holding power, or a Savarna stage, because if the stage is not theirs, then the mic is theirs. If the mic is not theirs, then the audience is them. If the audience is not them, then the platform is theirs, as in the foundation is theirs. You get what I'm saying? So it's a matter of really working at it, giving yourself time and doing this collectively, doing this strategically, doing this wholeheartedly, and doing this across the board. It's not just arts, and it's not just academia, it's not just the corporate, and it's not just the state. You have to be able to gain and get power and acquire it across the board in several ways possible for this to actually happen. Because this is not going to happen through just one way, right? Or one strategy, or by one person. It has to take everything. I'm aware that this is not necessarily a very helpful answer, but this is the best I can come up with, in the sense, like, we know what's out there and we know what we want. But sometimes I think we tend to look for easy answers when there exists none.
Absolutely. Yashika, any closing thoughts? Christina just shared some brilliant wisdom to us, which I'm going to be thinking about for a while.
I just want to say I'm always in awe of Christina's brilliance, and I've said it on so many platforms. I can't say it enough. Every time she speaks, I'm just like, wow. So, I can only add a little bit to what she's already, I couldn't have said it better myself. When Christina talked about a mesh, it's such a beautiful allegory, right? Because we are constantly prodding, and it's like huge thing. Many of us, it requires a collective effort. I was thinking of that same analogy, but in terms of a wave, what this is not a ceiling, but it's a wave. And all we're doing is standing stranded on an island trying to catch it with our bare hands. And it completely goes away. Sure, we get a few drops of water here and there, but the wave keeps coming, keeps leaving us, and coming back with this tiny promise that one day we might be able to hold enough water / power in our hands in order to effect change. But really, the wave is way more powerful than that. And exactly what Christina said about, if it's not the audience, if it's not the stage, if it's not the platform, we are in these structures. Ultimately, we are boxed, and they decide whether we get an invite again the next time or not. We have to be so careful about how we speak, what we speak about, because one assertion too many, and if they feel like, oh, they're arrogant about their power, we will not be invited back. And we don't have platforms of our own to create or generate that kind of power. So that's one. And the second thing I do want to add is that this change that we are speaking about, let's remember how recent this is. And Savarnas, whether they're in academia, whether they're in tech, whether they're in corporate, have not done this willingly. They have done this because they have to preserve their model minority power. Indian Americans in the United States, we have a vice president in the White House who is South Asian American. The whole goodwill that we have acquired is by being this successful, benign community that's mostly woke, that's mostly liberal. We vote Democrats. Why wouldn't anybody like us? We are unproblematic, right? Especially Hindus. But since caste came on the scene, and it is only exceptionally because of Dalit voices, because of cases like the Cisco case, because of the bravery of that one Dalit engineer who put his job on the line to hold companies like Cisco, to hold that kind of power accountable, that now the whole establishment is rushing to, dust their cobwebs, basically, to mend their broken quilts and understand that, oh, wow, these Dalits are speaking about power. And clearly it's a big deal. American media seems to be paying attention. How do we want to project ourselves? It's not altruistic. It's not a change of heart. And you can definitely viewers who are tuned in will say, well, these people are very cynical. We have every reason to be. Why have we been screaming hoarse for 2-3 decades? Ambedkar International Center is one of the organizations that was created decades ago. It still doesn't have that kind of mainstream recognition. Why have we been just echoing ourselves in dark corners and not reaching anywhere? And why does it take now for that to happen? Why does it take a Cisco case for it to happen? Why does it take Dalit voices to loudly and assertively talk about themselves for that change to happen? That change is not being given to us. We are snatching it from the jaws of power, and it's still like a wave that we are unable to hold on to. And it's only being done only because Indians are a minority in the United States, and everything that they do and how they're perceived depends on how the liberal majority perceives them. And if they want to create this veneer of liberalism in the streets and fundamentalism in the streets, like I've talked about this before, prime example being Priyanka Chopra, who's happy, selling skin lightening creams back home. And here she's talking about how she's a brown woman. She's been, subjected to racism, which is absolutely true, I'm sure, but I'm highlighting the diabolic nature of, the Savarna mentality. The only reason now they're rushing to sort of make these amends and include Dalit voices and have a Dalit panel is because it's the hot topic of the day. And we know American public doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't have a high, long-term memory. Mm-hmm. So it is up to us to make sure that it remains the hot topic of the day. But where is this labor and this vigilance, as Christina brilliantly termed it, comes from? It comes from Dalit folks. So if there is a change that you're seeing, if people like us are on platforms, it's not because Savarnas want to do it willingly. It's because we came here, showed ourselves, and refused to leave. And because the Americans, the liberal establishment is paying attention, the Indians have no choice but to follow suit. They're not doing it because they want to.
Absolutely. And, on that note, congratulations on the Sahitya Academy and for accepting it. As you said, for you to give up power, you have to first have that power. And,
Thank you.
um, you're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's part of learning that Dalit history of other feminists and activists who have paved the way for you all to also do this work. And on your shoulders are going to be other younger generations of feminists, right, who are going to take it forward. And that gives a lot of hope. I think that way the sieve will be, we will tear it up. And I don't even know what will look like, but I'm just really blown by the two of you and your analysis, and I want to go rewatch that film. So thank you so much. Any
Thank you.
closing thoughts that I didn't get to ask you as a question? I know, I've already kept you way past your time.
One thing that I wanted to mention, which was part of your earlier question list, Preeti, and we didn't get to talk about, but I thought was a very important aspect to bring up, was this thing about Dalit celebration, stories of Dalit celebration was the stories of Dalit victimhood. Indeed, I feel like we are very much saturated with images and stories and lives of, how Dalits are suffering and, being oppressed and tortured and all of it, accumulating into, trauma porn or, whatever. And it's also easier to evoke somebody's emotion if you're going to be showing a really sad side of one's life or one's story. And so I think it's absolutely important that we also have stories of laughter and celebration and a whole bunch of it. But I want to be mindful of how this discourse may discourage Dalit women and Dalit gender minorities from telling their stories as it is, because I don't want us to think that, oh, I don't want to tell my story because it's going to be a story of victimhood. I don't want that discourse to in some way discourage people from telling their stories or making films out of their stories, or, in whichever way you want to kind of, bring it out to the open. You should be able to tell your story, regardless of what narrative it is catering to or it's supposedly catering to. And the way to do that is to work towards a body of work towards a situation, work towards a world where there are so many of us telling stories, where there are different types of us, all kinds of us telling all kinds of stories. So we don't get stuck by just one story and one model and one, way of
one box
telling it.
Yes, absolutely.
So if there are like just so many stories out there, it doesn't really matter. There's a story of victimhood. Well, there's a story of laughter too. There's a story of liberation too, or celebration too. So I think we should definitely work towards it. And on that note, I think Khabar Lahariya does a brilliant job of that. Mm-hmm. But also as a dream, I feel like will we get to a world, and how soon would we get to a world where we are the ones making these films and we are the ones doing it at film festivals and winning awards and stuff like that.
Yes, I hope funders are like taking note of this and fund the sports directly, not the middlemen. So absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to, I don't have much to add beyond what Christina already said, but I do want to say that what you just said, the danger of the single narrative, it's something that, my whole body of work is an example of how we need desperately different kinds of stories to tell people that Dalits are not a monolith. That while we have so much trauma, which is induced on us through shame, through, violence, whether it's emotional, verbal, or physical, and those stories are so important to tell. But I think what is the need of the hour is to give the mic, the proverbial mic, the camera, like Christina said, to Dalits. Because, as a person, I'm multidimensional. As a person, any Dalit woman, any Dalit man, gender non-confirming person, they are multidimensional. They go through immense sadness, immense pain, but they also have moments of laughter. So if we were to, and I think, coming back to the filmmakers, they did try and bring that that respite, that relief in the movie when we have this, finally we get one shot of the family, Mira's family, enjoying this collective lunch on Republic Day. And, she's kind of has this coy moment that she shares with her husband. And that just felt like a moment of relief. But what we need is for Dalit filmmakers to, first of all, have the platform to do this, it's a skill that you learn in a school. So have the access to go to that school to learn that skill in order to fully present themselves as who they are, as full people. We're not perpetually sad. We're not perpetually crying, even though we are forced to most of the time. But we have to tell our own stories in a collective way. That's extremely important. And in terms of joy, in terms of, trauma, in terms of alleged victimhood, because that's a part of our lives too. So it's really important for Dalits to be able to tell their own stories and different kind of stories. And in terms of just coming back to, recommendations, I would say a good place for especially, non-Dalit folks who are South Asian origin and Americans in general who are non-South Asian, watch anything that is made by a Dalit person. I think that's a really good way to go about it.
Yeah.
Whether, look for, there is more than enough material available, especially now. Think about what kind of stories they are telling, and think about, use that as a stepping stone to launch yourself into a career, or an education in caste. Don't just use this movie as something fancy to show off in the next party that you go to.
Absolutely. Well, on that very inspiring note, I will say thank you. And I want us to have another conversation on the whole Isabel Wilkerson and Caste book, because it was such a pandemic reading last year. And you brought it up, but another time, I think I will let you go. I just definitely want to flag that as something for a future conversation. Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Christina and Yashika, and thanks for all the work. This was much more inspiring than I am ready for, so I'm very grateful. Thank you for your work, and hope to be, hope this opens doors for more Dalit feminist filmmaking. Absolutely, and I'll make sure that the filmmakers hear what you have to say. That's my
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Preeti. Thanks for this.
Thank
you,
you.
Yashika.
Thanks,
so
Preeti.
lovely to
Thanks,
be on a
Christina.
panel with you.
Yeah, it's the first time. I can't imagine how. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye.